All right, everybody, thanks for coming to another fantastic session of the IDE lunch webinars this semester. I'm Sinan Aral, the director of the IDE. Housekeeping-wise, if we could just make sure to mute our microphones and videos to minimize distraction. And we will be having the seminar for an hour, and we're going to leave time at the end for questions. So as you have questions, just post them to the chat and I'll curate them at the end. And if there's something that's a clarifying question that really needs to be answered right away, I'll break in and try to interrupt Sharad so that he can keep everybody posted on clarifying questions and answers. We're really excited today to have Sharad Goel, who is an assistant professor at Stanford in the MSNE, the Management Science and Engineering Department at Stanford. And he is the founder and director of the Stanford Computational Policy Lab, which is just doing a fantastic set of work, really at the forefront of things like criminal justice, which he'll be talking about today, but also voting rights, election integrity, education, and so on. And he really brings, a computer science, computational, but also a sociological and legal perspective to these types of questions. He is an applied mathematician with a PhD from Cornell, and he was a senior researcher at Microsoft before joining Stanford. So this computational perspective should be pretty apparent. Guillaume, if we could just take off our video and mute our video and audio, thanks. And I think you're going to really enjoy this talk because having seen Sharad present some of these types of topics in the past, I find it really amazing what we can learn by going through the computational evidence of things like criminal justice outcomes and how that really sheds light on the way decisions are made and the way the system sort of directs outcomes in society. And it really is eye-opening. So with that, I want to welcome Sharad Goel, and I'll turn it over to you and see you on the flip side.
Thanks, Sinan. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to present. Just to confirm, can everyone see this?
Looks great.
Okay, great. So today I'll talk about some of the work that we're doing in equitable algorithm design for criminal justice. Some of these applications will be criminal justice motivated, but a lot of the ideas will be much broader than that. So as Sinan indicated, I started and direct the Computational Policy Lab at Stanford. And we're a bit of a unique organization in that we are a formal academic research group, but our mandate is to drive social impact outside of the university using the types of technical ideas that I'm going to talk about today. And to do so, we rely on a team of researchers, engineers, professionals, staff engineers, journalists that use technology to drive reform in a variety of domains, including criminal justice, education, healthcare, voting rights, and beyond. And typically, when we think about problems, I frame it in three different ways, three different approaches to these problems. One is data integration, data collection. So an example of this is about 6 years ago, we started collecting data on police stops using public records requests. To date, we've collected something like 200 million individual level traffic stop records that we've cleaned, released, and it's one of the most comprehensive such data sets now out there. And using these types of new data sets, often that we've collected and released, we develop statistical methodology, computational tools to investigate kind of policy relevant questions. So in that particular example that I gave about policing, one of the motivating questions was trying to understand places in which bias is entering into these decisions and then ways that we can mitigate those types of biases, which is this last part, which is actually the part that I'm most excited about of the work of the Computational Policy Lab, is that we, in many cases, work directly with policymakers, with government agencies, with nonprofit organizations to design and deploy algorithms that our goal is to reduce social stratification. And so this, for just again, one quick example, we recently deployed an in San Francisco in the district attorney's office, a natural language processing algorithm that reduces or that tries to minimize race-related information from police narratives when prosecutors are making charging decisions. And so this is now being used by the office to review felony cases that come through their door. And that's, again, a type of platform that we're starting to roll out across the country. So I'll give a couple more examples of these things throughout the talk, but that's really just to set the stage for the type of work that we're doing in the lab. So today I'm going to talk about some of the more foundational work that helps us when we're trying to design these algorithmic interventions. And again, the key or the one of our goals when we deployed these types of algorithmic interventions is to make outcomes more equitable, whatever that means. I'm going to use this word equity, fairness in a colloquial sense. I'll try to get more into what it means formally in a bit, but in this colloquial sense, we want outcomes to be better. But the first part of my talk, I'm going to argue that the common axiomatic approach that has dominated the computer science literature in recent years, this axiomatic approach to fairness, is often at odds with important policy relevant, legal relevant, socially relevant understandings of equity. And so this is, I want to flag at the outset that this is actually a pretty controversial statement. To date, there have probably been hundreds, if not thousands, of papers written using this type of axiomatic approach to fairness. And really my punchline is for this part of the talk is that I think there's a fundamental disconnect between that approach and what you actually care about in many cases on the ground. Now, I hope people don't walk away, kind of halfway through the talk and think the message is, everything is broken, because the second part of the talk, I'll try to present a more positive message of saying that I think there aren't easy answers, but in many cases, there are better ways of thinking about equity that disentangles the predictive aspects of our algorithms from the decision-making aspects that policymakers often face. And so this is, in many ways, the second part encapsulates the way that I think about equity when we're deploying algorithms right now. And so again, there's not going to be an easy answer, and this is part of what I'm going to talk about at the beginning. Is I think one of the appeals of this axiomatic approach to fairness is that it is, in a sense, easy. There's formal definitions, you can verify those definitions, or you can check if those definitions are violated, and that's part of the appeal. And I'll argue that we're not going to have as an easy answer. I'm not going to present as easy an answer at the end of the day, but I think it will be an answer that is productive in many settings. So that's just the framing. So let's just dive right in to part one, assessing bias in risk models. So again, the motivating question here is, are risk models fair, whatever that word means? This is what we're going to try to understand. And just for a little bit of context, as you all probably know, statistical models of risk are now used in a variety of domains in banking, medicine, criminal justice, a variety of domains to guide high stakes decisions. And for this first part, I'm going to talk about criminal justice applications. The second part, I'll talk about some banking applications, but the ideas are really quite general to a variety of these domains. So the motivating example here is what are called pretrial release decisions. So shortly after an individual is arrested in the United States, judges have to make this high stakes decision about whether or not to release or detain that individual while they await their upcoming court dates. So the goal here is to balance flight risk and public safety on the one hand with the burdens imposed by detaining an individual on the other. And so these burdens could be financial burdens, they could be social burdens, job loss, disconnection from family. So this is, quite a high stakes decision. I mean, there's no easy answers in that, the costs and benefits are both large, and we want to equitably balance these things. So traditionally, these were made based on experience, intuition. Judges, over the course of their career, they're seeing thousands of these cases. They build some intuition, perhaps, and are making these decisions in that way. But there's been a recognition that despite this type of expert judgment, we believe that humans are still prone to all sorts of biases, inefficiencies, and also biases against certain groups. And so there's been this movement across the United States to incorporate the results of algorithmic statistical risk assessment tools when making these types of pretrial decisions. And so at a basic level, what do these tools do? They try to estimate the likelihood that a defendant will fail to appear at their trial or commit future crimes. So these are the two outcomes that are common in this type of decision-making setting. Okay, so let me, again, to make this very concrete, let me show you an example of what one of these tools looks like. I'm going to use the word algorithm in many cases, and I don't want you to think algorithm as being like some big deep learning model. Like, in some of these cases it is, but in many of these cases, the algorithm is really just a weighted checklist like this. And so this is, this is a popular, what's called the public safety assessment that is used in many jurisdictions. It's based on these 4 questions. And so if we have a hypothetical defendant with no other pending charges, no prior convictions, no prior missed court appearances in the last 2 years, or 2 prior missed court appearances in the last 2 years, and no prior missed court appearances before that, then we just add up these points. In this hypothetical case, we get a 5 out of 7, and we might normatively call this quote unquote high risk. Okay, so that's just, again, to set the stage on what we're talking about here. So now the first question, or the question I really want to focus on here, is, are these things fair? It's like there's evidence that these tools are more accurate than unaided human decision makers, and that they can predict recidivism with more accuracy. But there's still this fundamental question of, are these tools fair? And this question is obviously been around for quite a long time, but I would say it really got a lot of attention outside of this narrow community of people thinking about this issue about 4 or 5 years ago, when ProPublica, the investigative news organization, wrote this this in-depth piece, which, and I think the title pretty much says it all: machine bias. There's software used across the country to predict future criminals, and it's biased against blacks. And so what they're talking about here is exactly the type of tool that I just showed you a minute ago. So these pretrial risk assessment tools, the claim here is that they're biased in particular against black defendants. So I want to spend the next 20 minutes or so unpacking that claim and trying to understand what's going on here. Okay, so again, just to give you a guidepost of where we're going, what I'm going to argue is that most mathematical measures of fairness, including the ones used by ProPublica in their analysis, are poor proxies for detecting discrimination. And not only are they poor for detecting discrimination, if you use them as design constraints, which now is becoming increasingly popular, if you use these conditions as design constraints, then they can quite perversely lead to discriminatory decisions. Okay, so it's double bad. Both they're bad in detecting discrimination, and also using them as design constraints can lead to discriminatory decision making. Now, I want to clarify, this isn't saying that all tools are equitable, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about in the second half of the talk. But what I am saying here is that this dominant way of evaluating the equity of tools and in designing tools in a way that may appear to be equitable, in fact, is counterproductive in many situations. Okay, so there are several common ways of formally defining what fairness means in this setting. I'm going to talk about 2 big ones. The first is classification parity. This is the one used by ProPublica, or a version of this was used by ProPublica. And here an algorithm is considered to be fair if error rates are approximately equal for white and black defendants. And I'm going to phrase everything in terms of this concrete example that we've been talking about in pretrial decisions, but you can imagine this all generalizes to a variety of settings. And also, for simplicity, I'm going to talk about 2 groups here, white and black individuals, but again, you can imagine this generalizes relatively straightforwardly. Okay, so again, classification parity in the algorithm is considered to be fair if error rates are approximately equal for white and black defendants. Now, this is a very popular notion of algorithmic fairness. It, in fact, made it into proposed legislation in Idaho last year. Again, this is language that was taken from the proposed legislation. Pretrial risk assessment algorithms shall not be used by the state until first shown to be free of bias, meaning the rate of error is balanced as between protected classes and those not in protected classes. So really just, in spirit, repeating this idea that that fairness means that we have similar error rates across groups. So the first question is, well, what do we even mean by error rates? There are many, many ways to define error. And actually, most of what I'm going to talk about is going to apply, actually all of what I'm going to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so will apply to every sort of conceivable measure of error, every common measure of error that you've likely encountered. But for concreteness, I'm going to focus on false positive rate. Both because it's very common in this community, and also because it's the definition that ProPublica used in their analysis. And so, what does false positive rate mean? I always forget these definitions. So let me let's remind ourselves, what does this mean in this particular example? What it means is, among people who did not ultimately go on to reoffend, what proportion were deemed high risk by the algorithm? Again, among people who ultimately did not go on to reoffend, what proportion were deemed high risk by the algorithm? Okay, so this is what false positive rate means. And now, what did ProPublica find? They looked at the data in Broward County in Florida, where they were able to get these results, both the algorithmic assessments and also recidivism rates. And what they found was quite striking. What they found is that among Black defendants who did not reoffend, about a third, 31%, were deemed high risk by the algorithm of committing a violent crime. And among white defendants who did not ultimately go on to reoffend, about half as many, 15%, were deemed high risk by the algorithm of committing a violent crime. So both in an absolute sense and also in a relative sense, we have a quite striking gap in false positive rates between white and Black defendants in this particular jurisdiction. We repeated the analysis, and so there isn't anything kind of funny about the numbers. These are like the real numbers. So this is an actual, you compute this thing, this is what you get. Now, what I'm going to argue is that this feels intuitively bad. The first time I saw these results, I was like, oh, somebody messed up. And this algorithm is terrible, and something has like really gone wrong, and look at all this harm that we're causing. What I'm going to argue is that it's actually a much more subtle situation of what's going on here. And in fact, what is sort of my initial reaction to these numbers, and I suspect many of your initial reactions to these numbers, is in fact not telling us the whole story, and in a very specific sense is a misleading story from what we might naively take away from these numbers. Okay, so let me do this in pictures. Let me try to explain the argument in pictures. So let's say we have these two hypothetical populations, the blue group and the orange group. And below each of these individuals in these populations, I'm giving the risk that this individual will end up recidivating. So 10% here on the left-hand side in the low end of the scale, it's going to be 70% here on the high end of the scale. And I'm going to say, given the available data, this is perfectly estimated. So I'm not worrying about estimation error. I'm just going to say that we have this oracle that gives us these numbers for every individual. And it's not because I believe that we actually have this oracle, but the structure of the argument is, even in this perfect world where we have great information, where we don't have any estimation error, we're still going to have these kind of funny things happen. So that's just for each of these individuals. I have these risk estimates for everyone. And because I have two populations, I'm assuming these are non-random populations. And so I would expect that there are going to be different risk distributions across these two groups. And it's important here, I want to highlight that the risk distributions, and so how do I see the risk distributions? They're different. Well, this orange group is higher risk on average, is shifted to the right, and the actual distribution looks a little bit different. So I want to highlight here that differences in risk distributions shouldn't be thought of as an inherent property of a group. So I'm not saying somehow the orange group is inherently riskier than the blue group. What I'm saying is that we have this available information, and because of the correlations in that available information, let's say that risk is really determined by socioeconomics, and let's say that the blue group has kind of higher average socioeconomic status, the orange group has lower average socioeconomic status, I might expect different distributions of risk in that very simple scenario that I described. So in general, you can imagine there are all sorts of complicated reasons for which risk distributions between groups might be quite different, but it shouldn't be thought of as an inherent property of the group itself. Okay, so the final thing I want to point out about this picture is the way I'm going to make decisions here is I'm going to draw a line. So in this case, I just drew a line of 50%, and I'm going to call the people above that line high risk, the people below that line low risk. These are consequential classifications because high risk people, the default decision might be to detain them. Low risk people, the default decision might be to release them. So again, these are consequential. It's not just sort of an arbitrary label. I mean, these mean things. And the thing to note here is the way that I've made this decision. It doesn't matter so much where that line is for this argument, but the point is that there is a single line that I'm using. And so I'm saying conditional on risk. When I'm making this classification, this judgment, I'm not going to ask about your group membership at that point. And so I'm just saying, what is your risk? Based on that, if you're above 50% or if you're 50% or greater, regardless of group membership, I'm going to classify you as high risk. If you're below 50%, I'm going to classify you as low risk, and that's it. So this is the common way that decisions are actually made, or these risk assessment tools actually work in courts. Arguably, it's one of the only sort of legally justifiable ways right now to make these types of, to make these types of decisions, what is called these threshold rules, where we're not making judgments based on group membership, we're just making judgments based on risk. And so at the very least, I would say that this is one reasonable approach in a policy sense for making these types of classifications. Not the only way, but I would say one reasonable way. And now what I'm going to argue is that all sorts of funny things happen when we make decisions in this way. Okay, so now let's look at this blue group and let's try to understand what is a false positive rate in this blue group. Okay, so remember, what does the false positive rate mean? It means among people who did not reoffend, what proportion were deemed high risk. So here we have a few people highlighted in red here that happen to reoffend. So 5 people or 6 people happen to reoffend, and now 2 of these people. Sorry, let me try this one more time. 5 people happen to reoffend. That means 6 people happen to not reoffend. Of those these 6 blue people who happen to not reoffend, 2 of them were to the right of that dashed line, were deemed high risk. And so now we have a 25% false positive rate. I think I actually have not had my coffee this morning. I set the numbers wrong. So, but you understand what I'm saying here. The blue, the red people are the people who have reoffended in my example. The blue are the ones who have not reoffended. And now these 2 here are the ones that are deemed high risk. Great. Okay, so we just kind of mechanically compute these things in this particular example. We have a false positive rate of 25%. Okay, so now let's do the same thing for the orange group. So here, the orange group, remember, is shifted to the right. That means that more people on average will reoffend. That means that fewer people will not reoffend. That means the denominator is smaller in that fraction. And the numerator, the way I've drawn this example, will be greater. Okay, so just like walking through this again, in this particular case, our denominator is 6 people that did not reoffend. Our numerator is 2.5, and we end up with a false positive rate of 42%. Okay, so again, just mechanically summarizing what we've seen so far is when we have differences in risk distributions, and when we apply the same threshold, we see different false positive rates across these 2 groups. So the blue group has a lower false positive rate, 25%, than the orange group, which has a false positive rate of 42%. Now, what's going on here? So this is what economists have called, or at least in related contexts, have called the problem of infra-marginality, meaning that the statistic, the false positive rate, is an infra-marginal statistic in that it depends not only on the threshold itself, but what's going on in the entire distribution. The tails of the distribution in particular affect the false positive rate. And so our notions of equity, this idea that we should treat people similarly, people who have similar risk, we should treat people similarly, that's really a notion of what's going on with this threshold. But these statistics, and I would argue almost all popular summary statistics of error, suffer from this problem of infra-marginality in that they consider not only the threshold, but they consider that entire distribution of risks. So when we have different distributions of risk, we tend to have we tend to have differences in these metrics, even if we apply the same standard to all individuals in that group. So going back to the data, so what I showed you before, that was a stylized example. If we go back to the Broward County data, and we try to estimate the risk distributions for Black and white defendants in that population, we see exactly this phenomenon happening, that the distribution for Black individuals is different than the distribution for white individuals in this population. And in particular, we have this heavier tail of risk for Black individuals, which ends up altering our false positive rate, in this case, driving that higher false positive rate that we're observing in the data. Okay, so now you might say that, well, okay, I understand mechanically false positive rates are going to be different, even if I apply the same threshold. And you say, well, I guess I'm just not happy applying the same threshold. There's something still sort of fundamentally wrong. Like, even if this is just kind of what happens, it falls out, even if there's no estimation error in my numbers, this Black defendants of Broward County, the orange group in my stylized example I showed you before, are suffering these heavier burdens. And that's just not fair. Like, that's, I think, a pretty reasonable reaction to have. And now what I want to push back on is even that story doesn't quite pan out in many contexts. So why is that? So let's look at this group of this higher false positive rate, higher risk group of orange individuals in my stylized example. And we might reason, well, I don't like this higher false positive rate. So I want this orange group to have a lower false positive rate. Well, what can I do? Well, one thing I can do is I can go out and arrest a bunch of college protesters. And I want to say, first of all, obviously, this is a facetious example. I am not advocating for arresting college protesters. And the point of this is to show how things can go terribly wrong when we think of false positive rate as actually capturing what we fundamentally care about. So let's continue with the example. So we're going to go out and we're going to arrest a bunch of college protesters. So what's going to happen if we do this? Again, mechanically, what's going to happen is these are low-risk people. The algorithm knows that they're low-risk people. So the numerator is not going to change, but the denominator is going to increase when we do this false positive rate calculation. So before we had 42% for this orange group, if you remember, to 25% now when we arrest these college protesters. And again, all we had to do is to go from this inequitable situation, or we might kind of call inequitable, to this equitable situation. And all we had to do is go out and arrest a bunch of low-risk people. So again, the point here is not that this type of definition, this design principle, it has bad incentive properties, although I think it does in many cases. But I'm not actually worried about the officers going out and arresting college protesters to equalize false positive rates. That's not the point that I'm trying to make here. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the distribution matters. And so if you just look at this situation and you say, hey, I'm like unhappy about the situation, the orange group is really being burdened, and I know that because of this difference in false positive rates. And now I show you this. I don't tell you how I got to this place. I just show you this other data set. It's like, here's another city. I'm not telling you what's going on. Here's another city. And you look at this and you're saying, oh, I'm not so concerned because false positive rates are actually equal. And what I'm trying to highlight in this facetious example is to say that it's actually much more complicated, that you have to understand the origins of these distributions until you, without understanding that, you can't understand the equity of this decision-making process. So in that sense, false positive rate is a crude, and I would say in many cases, counterproductive way of assessing the equity of algorithmic decisions. So now the last thing I want to say about this particular example is this critique that I'm offering is not a broad critique of using error rates in machine learning. And so all of us, kind of what is a stylized ML paper? We have a bunch of algorithms, and we have like all of our state-of-the-art algorithms. We have our new algorithm, and we're just trying to beat state-of-the-art algorithms with our new algorithm on some particular error metric. So maybe this can be precision, recall, false positive rate. You pick your favorite metrics, and we say, hey, look, my algorithm is beating all these state-of-the-art algorithms, and that's great. And then we get to publish our paper. And that actually works, I think, at least for its intended purpose, but it's not what is going on here. So in that situation, this like ML paper publishing situation, what's going on there is we have multiple algorithms and one data set. And we're saying, let's evaluate all of our algorithms on that same data set. So it's an apples to apples comparison. What's going on here is we have effectively one algorithm in multiple data sets. What are the multiple data sets? We have the blue group and the orange group in the stylized example. Our one algorithm is this one risk assessment tool that we're evaluating. So it's a very different situation. Here, it's one algorithm, multiple data sets. In the standard ML context, it's multiple algorithms, one data set. And so in the ML context, it's apples to apples. In this context here that I'm talking about, it's an apples to oranges comparison in the sense that different data sets might be more or less difficult to make predictions on. That's like the spirit of what's going on here. And so if I tell you the error rates of this one algorithm on different data sets, that could be a property of the data sets themselves, not necessarily a property of that one algorithm that I'm talking about. And so this is really, it's a subtle distinction between these two ways in which we use error rates in practice. Okay, so now I want to very quickly talk about the second notion of equity that comes up in algorithmic decision making. Intuitively, if you just kind of ask a random person on the street, I think the first thing you might think of yourself, if you're new to this area, is saying, you know, an algorithm is fair, a low bar. One particular bar for an algorithm being fair is that it doesn't use protected characteristics like race or gender. And a little bit more thought, and you say, well, okay, that's like a really low bar, because in many cases we can have these blind, facially neutral policies that are still discriminatory. Redlining in financial services, this is an example of it, but you can think of many other examples where people can use proxies to effectively discriminate without using the protected characteristics themselves. Now, this is prompted a whole kind of subfield of algorithmic fairness, where there's a question of how do you remove the influence of proxy variables on decision-making and on the algorithmic risk assessments. But what I'm going to argue here is that in some contexts, it's unfair to not use protected characteristics. And again, I'm not arguing that you should always use these types of protected characteristics, but I want to push back on some of this common intuition that fairness means not using this information. And so in some important contexts, not using that information can lead to inequities. So to see this, let's go to Broward County again. So here, this is a true fact in Broward County and also in other parts of the country. Women are less likely to reoffend than men of the same age with similar criminal histories. And those are exactly the types of factors that are used in these algorithmic risk assessments. So what is the consequence of this fact that we see in Broward County? Well, if we go to the particular risk assessment tool, it's called the Compass. If you look at the results of this tool in Broward County, what do we see? So here are the scores on a scale from 1 to 10. And the y-axis, on the vertical axis, we see the actual empirical recidivism rate. And what we see here is for any particular number, the recidivism rate for any given algorithmic score, this is a gender blind risk score, any specific score, the recidivism rate for women is less than the recidivism rate for men. And so what's the consequence of that? If we draw a line somewhere, let's say 8, and let's say this is our definition of what high risk means, and we say, let's look at women who score, you know, right at that threshold or right at that cusp of high risk, they're actually about as risky as men who are solidly in this low risk part of the spectrum. Okay, so using this gender blind tool is creating this inequity in that it's classifying women as higher risk than men who are in fact equally risky. And so if you use a gender blind model, then that could create burdens for women in Broward County, and actually we can see this phenomenon in jurisdictions all across the country. So one can fix this issue by using one model for men and another model for women, or by including gender in the model. And this is actually not, you know, this is done in practice. It's not super common, but it's done in practice, and at least in some places. So Wisconsin, for example, is using gender-specific risk assessment tools. But that, you know, it's not clear. They're different costs and benefits from including protected characteristics directly in your model, in particular the perceptions of equity in the broader criminal justice system that I think we have to consider. So I don't want, again, the take home to be that we definitely should use these protected characteristics. I just want to point out that not using them can create inequities itself. So it's sort of highlighting the ways our intuition can go wrong in these types of problems. So lastly here, I want to highlight that I've been really talking about this world where the data, I've argued, were kind of perfect or unbiased in some sense. And it's like, even in that perfect world, we have all these counterintuitive results. But in practice, the data are biased, and we do have to worry about that. I don't think it makes any of these issues that I'm talking about any easier to deal with, but I do want to acknowledge that the data in the real world do have all sorts of biases. And one in particular is what's called measurement error or a label error, that algorithms estimate the probability of, in this pretrial situation, that an individual will be observed or reported committing a future crime. But that's only a proxy for whether or not a crime actually occurs. And so we see this particularly for low-level offenses. So we might measure the likelihood that someone will get arrested for a low-level drug offense. That tells us actually not a whole lot about their likelihood of being involved in low-level drug activity. And so we know from surveys that drug use is comparable across race groups, but arrests and convictions for drug use are heavily concentrated among Black and Hispanic individuals, which shows that this proxy error is quite real and quite consequential. I'm going to give you one last example here. In St. George's Hospital in the UK, they developed an algorithm to sort medical school applicants. They trained the algorithm to mimic past admissions decisions made by the human evaluators. Again, what you really want to know, you want to know who's a good fit for the program. What they're actually predicting here is who was admitted in the past. But past decisions, it turned out, were biased against women and minorities, so the algorithm just simply codified discrimination against, because of the way that this algorithm was designed. We're not predicting what we actually want to predict. We're predicting this biased proxy of what we fundamentally care about. Okay, so again, the punchline so far has been that the standard axiomatic way of thinking about fairness in much of the computer science literature has these, in my view, pretty deep flaws. And so what can we do going forward? I think there is a lot that we can do going forward, but it requires a lot of hard work, and it requires a lot of tough decisions. I think that is fundamentally unavoidable. And so let me describe this more positive vision of how we can work going forward. So I think the key idea is that algorithms, we want to separate statistical algorithms, risk assessment algorithms, from the policy decisions themselves. So statistical risk assessment algorithms are often very good at synthesizing information. They've been shown over decades of work to be better than unaided humans at estimating risk, but we still must set equitable policy. So, for example, to make this concrete, in pretrial decisions, we might limit money bail. We might consider non-custodial interventions when we see that somebody is high risk. And so this is actually something that we're doing in the lab. We're about to roll out in about a dozen cities across the country. We're identifying individuals who are at risk of missing their court appearances, and then we're automatically ordering door-to-door rideshare service for them to get them from their home to the courtroom, because we know that in many cases, the reason they're not making it to court is because they live far from public transportation, they don't have a car, they have other constraints on their time. And so it's not for some kind of difficult to fix problem, but the reason that they're missing court and the reason that they're being flagged as high risk is for this very easily addressable issue. And so the algorithms for estimating risk are conventional. The policy decision of adding support is unconventional. And so that is this way I would say that we can translate from making these inequitable decisions to a much more equitable way of setting policy. Okay, so now I want to switch gears just a little bit and give you one more example in the lending context to illustrate some of these points more formally. So in the US, 20% of US households have no mainstream credit. They're not eligible for small dollar loans. What's interesting is that about 75% of these households with no mainstream credit, they stayed current on their bills. So think like household bills like electricity, water, and that suggests that in fact they would be good candidates for receiving and repaying these small dollar loans, even though they don't have mainstream credit. Now, this is a particularly problematic situation because these households are disproportionately Black and Hispanic. And so the motivating question is, how can we design a more inclusive lending policy? So our challenge is we want to allocate resources to underserved groups, namely individuals without mainstream credit, while remaining relatively efficient giving loans to those who are most likely to repay. So think of ourselves as a government lender, and we want to sort of maintain some kind of approximate budget balance in expectation. We want to make sure that we're giving loans to people who can approximately, repay these things, but we also want to allocate these resources in some equitable way. That's our main problem that we're facing here. So let's again think about these stylized situations where we have these two groups. I'm going to call one an unbanked group and one as a banked group. These are just shorthands for people who have mainstream credit, people who don't. And now I score them using a risk assessment tool. What do I have here? A couple things I want to note. The first is that these unbanked group in blue, they're higher risk on average of not repaying. So the scale here is showing the likelihood of repaying the loan. So not a chance on the left-hand side, absolutely on the right-hand side. And so this group, this blue group, is less likely to repay their loan. The other thing to notice is that this group here, this blue group, is clustered. And why is it clustered? Because we don't have that much information about this group. They're unbanked. We don't have that much. We don't have credit history on them. It's harder for us to distinguish in that group who is high risk and who is low risk. So now, what is one way that I can make this lending decision? I can draw a threshold. I can say everyone to the right of the threshold gets the loan. Everyone to the left of the threshold, they don't get the loan. This is the sort of thing that we saw in the pretrial context. An alternative way that I might make this decision is having a multiple threshold, two thresholds, where I have one threshold for the blue group and one threshold for the red group. And whenever I deviate from a single threshold, I am losing efficiency in the sense that I've lowered the overall repayment rate in this group because I'm swapping out these higher risk. I'm swapping in these higher risk people for these lower risk people over here in red. But I'm doing this for some benefit, and namely the benefit is I now get to give loans to some people in the blue group and some people in the red group. So this, again, I'm going to talk about this more formally in a minute, but this is the central idea that if I have set a policy that explicitly focuses on equity, I have this trade-off. I can estimate this trade-off between fulfilling equity in the sense of group representation and this trade-off with efficiency or this narrower sense of utility. And now I have to pick a point that I'm happy with along this curve that I'm going to explain in a minute, along this trade-off curve. Okay, so before doing that, though, I want to return to this question of why is it that one of these groups, this blue group, what can we do about the fact that this blue group was pretty clumped together and we don't have much information on them? So the idea here is that we don't have much information on them. We don't have their credit history, and so we want to go in and find. We want to spend more time, more money to get more information on people that we don't know that much about. And so, for example, we might examine their household bills. This takes time, this takes money, but we can invest those resources for some people. So we go back to our stylized example. Here's our blue group. Let's say we got information on all of them. Maybe it looks like this now, so we can separate them out, the high risk and the low risk people. Maybe we set a single threshold once we've gotten this extra information, or maybe even here, we go back and set a double threshold. So again, we still have this trade-off. We're not getting around this trade-off between this notion of narrow utility, efficiency, and equity, but we can change that trade-off by collecting information on certain people. So again, that's the second idea that I want to highlight, and I'm going to put this together in a minute to look at these strategies. And so in this stylized example, what I showed you was it was getting information on everybody in that low information blue group. That's a little bit of a waste of resources. If someone is clearly above the threshold, clearly below the threshold, there's probably not value to spending resources and getting information on them. So we want to collect information on people who are close in some sense to the threshold. So that's an idea that I'm not going to specifically tell you about how we formalize that, but I'm going to show you the results. And the idea here, if you're interested, is that we can frame this as constrained optimization, where we're trying to optimally allocate resources to collect information on people who it would be most useful for, but I'm not going to go into the details of that. I'll give you a pointer at the end, but that's our high level idea. And now let me show you the results of putting all of these pieces together in a simulation exercise. we're going to use this kind of popular data set of German credit. We'll have 1,000 individuals, 70% of whom are creditworthy. We're going to think of two groups here corresponding to our banked and unbanked group in the stylized example that I talked about before. These are going to be, the groups are going to be defined by whether or not they own their own residence. Those who own a residence are about a quarter of the population, and those who do not, about 3/4 of the population. Homeowners are more creditworthy in this data set, about 75% versus 60%. And so we want to have some kind of balance of equity across these two groups and efficiency in this particular example. So here we're going to, again, think of small dollar loans. And we're going to assume that the cost of screening is about 10% of the loan amount. So so imagine these are $1,000 loans, and the additional screening, look at someone's utility bills, is about $100. That's roughly the sort of domain we're in. So now, this is probably the most important plot of this, I would say, positive way of thinking about algorithmic fairness. And so let me walk through this slowly here. So we have two axes where the horizontal axis is showing us the amount of utility that we can get from any particular strategy for our targeted group. So think of this unbanked group in the stylized example, or people who don't own their own home. We can say how much utility for any given strategy is obtained by this targeted group. And on the vertical axis, here is a total utility that our population of individuals is accruing, kind of regardless of how much utility is accrued by that targeted group. And so the point here is that one strategy where we don't prioritize this targeted group, we might say we actually maximize population level utility, but that comes with the cost of not providing any utility to that targeted group. And as we change as we change our strategy for allocating, we change the thresholds that we're using. In that stylized example, we're changing this trade-off between how much utility is going to the targeted group versus how much utility is going to the overall population. And what I'm arguing is that in many real-world policy settings, this is fundamentally where the statistic stops and where the policy starts. So we can estimate these curves, in certain situations we can estimate these curves, but then we don't know where we should sit, normatively, where should we sit on this curve. And so that's hard. And this is what we present to policymakers when we do this in practice. We generate these types of curves, and then we elicit preferences from decision makers and say, hey, this is about as good as you can do, but you have to tell us where you want to sit on this Pareto frontier. And again, that's where the statistic stops and the policy starts. So now there's a little bit more to this story, and that why did we care about acquiring information for certain groups? Well, the reason we cared about that is that when we have this type of screening, this efficient screening policy of let's look for more information on people who are uncertain about, we can actually make this trade-off less severe. And so that's what this blue line is showing us. It's saying that when we are efficiently trying to acquire information on people that we don't have good risk estimates for, that might be close to the threshold of receiving these loans or not, then we in fact can create a new curve where the trade-off between the utility for this targeted group is related in a different way to the utility for the overall group, and in a way where these trade-offs are just not as severe. So that is highlighting the value of collecting more information in this particular setting. Okay, so now the summary here is that the punchline is that what I think of as equitable decision-making fundamentally in many of these important policymaking settings requires a trade-off between competing concerns. And this is not the same trade-off. If you're familiar with the algorithmic fairness literature, often this trade-off is framed in terms of error rates. And what I argued in the first part of the talk is that these error rates are not actually capturing what we fundamentally care about in many of these settings. And so here I'm talking about a trade-off between different policy-relevant concerns. So in this lending example, this might be the number of loans that I'm actually able to sustain in equilibrium given these repayment rates, and the number of loans that I'm able to give to members of a particular group. And so these are at odds with one another. The more loans I want to give to members of a particular group, that could overall increase the average expenses of issuing these loans because I have higher repayment rates, which means fewer people will get loans at the end of the day. So that's a real trade-off. These are, I would say, policy relevant dimensions that we care about. And again, this is where I think of the statistics as more or less ending once we generate that type of trade-off and where the hard policy making starts. Now, the second kind of summary point here is that there is value to acquiring information, and that in traditional fairness work, we think of those features as static. We think of the data set as given to us, we create the algorithm, and then we maybe make decisions. Here, what I'm arguing is that you can be active in that approach and saying, in some cases that you should collect more information on certain people, and taking that active approach can fundamentally alter the trade-offs between these competing concerns. So I'll end with that. If you want to read more about this, check out these two papers. The first is The Measure and Mismeasure of Fairness. It's a joint work with Sam Corbett-Davies. It's a survey paper of a lot of what I talked about in the first half. The second paper is what I talked about in the second half, fair allocation through selective information acquisition, joint with a couple PhD students at Stanford. And if you're more broadly interested in this idea of computational public policy, please check out the work that we're doing at the Policy Lab. Thanks.
Awesome. That was fantastic. Really, really appreciate that. So let me ask you 3 quick questions, one from the chat and 2 that are on my mind. And if you've got additional questions, please ask them in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. So I'm going to ask these quickly. 1, how transparent are the software-based assistants to judicial, decision-making, say on bail or, or on release and so on? Can they be, properly audited in a sense? Are they open books or not? Secondly, when it comes to active learning, how do we think about the cost of acquiring that data and balancing it with the benefit of having the data, right? So presumably some of the data that we would want in an active learning situation is going to be costly. And, there's obviously a lot of work in the active learning literature about balancing costs and benefits, but here we've got sort of monetary costs of acquiring more data, and then we've got some non-monetary benefits. So how do you start to balance fairness versus, a public policy duty to sort of be efficient in terms of the acquisition of data? And then finally, from the chat, there was a question about, is this basically affirmative action? What's the relationship to affirmative action when we're thinking about outcomes as a primary, goal?
Yeah, those are 3 really great questions. Let me try to answer them in turn. So on transparency, I would say it varies quite a bit. I would say generally we're not at a place that I'm personally comfortable with. Many of these algorithms are being deployed. That one tool that I showed you was called the public safety assessment. That was exactly the tool. There's nothing hidden there. That literally that 4-question checklist is what is being used in jurisdictions all across the country. And so in a very mechanical sense, it's transparent. It's not transparent in the way that where do those questions come from? Where do those weights come from? And so there is this there's still a complicated question of what do you mean by transparent, but at least I can say this is literally mechanically how a decision is being made for any one individual. I would say that is, I don't know if that's the exception, but it's definitely not it's not the rule, but it's also not the exception. And so it's like somewhere in between. Like many jurisdictions are using tools like that. Not all jurisdictions are using tools like that. The Compass, this one that's using in Broward County, we don't know the weights, but we know the features. And so there's some kind of, there's a spectrum of things there. But I think that's like an easy, I think at least in criminal justice, we should contracts should be signed that require complete transparency when using these tools. I don't think there's any IP concern here. This is not rocket science. This is basically logistic regression at the end of the day. There's not a secret sauce there. I'm not worried about competition in that space. And so I don't think there's any good reason for that particular example to not be fully transparent. In all of the work that we do in this space, we make our code available. Our data, they're privacy issues, but we try to make our data available to the extent that we're able. So the short answer is, yeah, there's some transparency. I think there can be more transparency. There should be more transparency. The second question on active learning, again, really, really good question. No easy answer here, in that it is hard in practice. There are two reasons why this is hard. The first reason is that it's hard just to statistically estimate what's going to change when you get more information. Now, in the lending sphere, we can get around this a little bit because there's so much, and there's so many transactions happening, and that it's almost certainly worth doing these small experiments on subpopulations to estimate the value of information. So that's an approach that we advocate, in that you just take a relatively small random subset of the population, you just get that information. I mean, this is similar to what's happening in a lot of sort of active learning settings in other domains. We just get that information, and now we're in a better place. We're in a warm start for these more complicated decisions that we have to make down the road. But the harder decision is, and I think this is at least tangentially related to the question, is where do we want to sit on that curve? What is the value? How much are we willing to trade this extra cost for this difference in outcomes? And I would still phrase that as, where do we want to sit on this Pareto frontier? So once we know the value of information, in theory, we can generate all these different Pareto frontiers. And we can say, or we can generate a single Pareto frontier where I pay more. And so that means something else is going to slip if I'm paying more for this information. That means I'm giving out fewer loans. So I'm just generating this Pareto frontier, but I still don't know where I'm going to sit. And that's just hard. And so the way, I alluded to this before, the way that we do this is that we're running preference solicitation surveys for policymakers, where we show this is literally what we think you can achieve. But now you have to tell us, what outcome do you want? Do you want to spend, do you want to give fewer loans? And the reason you're giving fewer loans is because you're going to prioritize certain groups, and you're going to collect information in these different ways. It's given all this stuff, at the end of the day, these are the outcomes that you have to choose between. You tell us, where do you want to sit? And so we show them pairwise comparison of different outcomes. We ask them to pick from these things. We can reconstruct their preferences, and now we can say, this is where we think you should be on the Pareto frontier. Now, for the last question, affirmative action, is I would say, yes, this is very similar. This Pareto frontier is this idea is very similar to that, but we're a little bit more general. And so so the way that it's similar is that we're saying that we have two competing interests. I mean, in education, this is particularly complicated because it's not even clear what that sort of the narrow non-group specific interest is. But let's say it's something like graduation rates. We're not talking about places like MIT. We're talking about places where sort of graduation rates across the country are something like 50% in many colleges. And so that is one measure of success is recruiting a student body that's able to successfully complete the program. So maybe that's one dimension of it. And another dimension is, how much are we, how diverse is our student body? And we might have a trade-off that we have to make here. And that trade-off is, we can statistically estimate, at least in some circumstances, but where we're going to sit on that curve is very, very difficult to know. And again, why do I think of that as sort of not a statistical question? Because it often has to do with long-term equilibrium effects. One, I think of the strongest rationales for affirmative action in education is that, one rationale is we locally receive benefits from a diverse student body. And I suspect all of you have experienced this in your own classes, both as students and faculty, that we reap the benefits of having a diverse student body that comes with kind of a variety of perspectives. Another benefit of a diverse student body is that we see these payoffs 20 years from now in terms of changing populations going forward. And so knowing exactly how our interventions today are going to have an effect 20 years from now is just extremely difficult. And so in some sense, it is a theoretically, theoretically it is a statistical question. In practice, I would say these externalities are so complicated that I don't like to even think of it as statistical. I just say, like, here are these two trade-offs, and now you have to tell me, you use your intuition to tell me how to do that trade-off. It's scientific. Like, I don't want to say it's like, not scientific, but it's so hard that I just think of it in a different way. So that's like, it's a close analogy to the way that I presented these results. But I've taken a very much a consequentialist utilitarian approach to presenting this notion of equity, which I think is not always the framing that is used for affirmative action in education.
So really quick one, you've answered some of the questions that were in the chat. For instance, you just talked a lot about certainty and uncertainty, and there was a question about how certain are we and about the different outcomes on the frontier, for instance. And I guess it depends a lot on whether we're talking about insurance or criminal justice, and whether we're talking about long-term or short-term and so on. But a quick question is there ever a case in which you would advocate eliminating the human, right? So there's, people say, oh, AI is biased. And then, it's almost these two retorts that I hear over and over again. AI is biased. And then, oh, but humans are even more biased. So what is the right balance of human and machine, where a machine is advising a human decision or making the decision and pulling the human out of the loop? And that'll be the last question. I'll just make an announcement about next week and we'll end. So give us your quick take.
So we'll end on that real softball question here.
Right, exactly.
To humans.
Just give us what the answer is.
Human and machines. So unsurprisingly, I don't have a particularly satisfying answer here. I think in reality, in judicial decision-making, in lending decisions, I think there has to be a mechanism for revisiting that machine decision. It's just, by law, this has to happen. And I would say just like, for kind of social cohesion, we have to have a mechanism for doing that. I think there's a real cost to doing that. Statistically, we've seen that purely algorithmic decision-making is often better and more equitable than mechanisms where we have the human able to override that algorithm. So there is this real cost here, but like in the short term, I just don't see us having a system where we're going to be, purely machine driven.
Cool. Sharad, this was amazing. Really, really appreciate you. To everyone who's watching, I just want to remind you that next week, October 7th, we have Kartik Hosanagar from Wharton. He's going to be talking about machine learning instrument variables for causal inference, which is going to be of great interest to this community as well. Sharad, thank you very much. This was fantastic. Look forward to reading those two papers and all the great work coming out of your lab. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks again for the invitation, and thanks for